Hi, everyone. My name is Kim Stemshorn, and I'm one of the many volunteers working behind the scenes to bring you today's much anticipated event. I'd like to welcome you to our first event of the Active and Healthy Week. It's the third week of events as a part of EcoFair Toronto 2020, and the webinar is called Equity and Access, the Importance of Affordable Transportation. I'd also like to mention that we have a series of community-created eco-tours listed on an interactive map on our website at ecofairtoronto.org, and it'll be mentioned in the chat. Eco-tours are created by the community and for the community. Rides throughout Toronto showcasing different eco destinations in our city and stops, including businesses and points of interest. Being a virtual event, you may be joining us from the Toronto area or elsewhere in Ontario, Canada, or even internationally. We're so thrilled to expand the scope of EcoFair's audience. If you're interested in obtaining a copy of the transcript of this webinar today, please write us at ecofairtoronto@gmail.com. This event you'll enjoy today is a part of a 4-week celebration of the start of a green new decade. Climate scientists have given us 10 years to turn things around. There are solutions, awesome people, groups, and businesses making amazing progress. So let's all celebrate their achievements and learn about solutions. We hope you find inspiration from this to take action. We're very excited about today's program and thankful to the organizers and presenters who have volunteered their time to make it happen, and to you, of course, for joining us. We'd like to begin by acknowledging and thanking the Indigenous peoples of this land. We are hosting this event today from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, we respectfully share this land acknowledgement as a way to recognize the enduring presence and resilience of Indigenous peoples from time immemorial. We also ask participants to reflect on how we all are accountable to these relationships. So thank you again for joining us. Now let's get this program started. I'd like to turn things over to our amazing moderator, Adrian Boyd from Urban Trans. Take it away, Adrian.
Thanks so much, Kim. Yeah, so welcome to our session tonight. Today we'll be talking about equity and access and the importance of affordable transportation. And it's all hosted by EcoFair, so thank you so much for putting this together and giving us a space to discuss this in such a great platform for everyone. So we'll be talking a little bit about how equitable mobility and access to affordable transportation intersects with sustainability, right? Because it is EcoFair after all. So we'll be hearing from 4 speakers tonight. And our session will be running from now, 7 o'clock, until 8:30 p.m. So we have our 4 speakers. We have today Patricia Burke-Wood from York University, Naomi Berber, she's a public space fellow with the Bentway Conservancy, Darnell Harris, he's the executive director of our Greenway, and Tarane Zarin, who's representing Free Transit Toronto. Just a few housekeeping tips for everyone who is watching this evening. If you're watching this live via YouTube, then we have the option for you to be submitting questions. How tonight will be working is that we will be doing speaker presentations. So they get 5 to 10 minutes to tell you a little bit about their organizations, their passion projects, what you should be considering right now. And then we're going to switch to Q&A for the last half hour of the session. So feel free to add questions. It's right along the sidebar next to the YouTube video. You do have to sign in, so either through a Google account or a YouTube account. You sign in and then you'll be able to add questions and send them to us, and we can pass them on and discuss it in the Q&A. So a little bit about myself. I've worked in the Scarborough and Etobicoke areas of Toronto for the last 5 years. Delivering commuter programs, so helping people try to get to work every single day. The big picture of the Smart Commute program, which is who I work for, we really want to shift away from the car dependency that we've grown into in our cities and suburbs. And I get to work with governments and nonprofits and corporations and individuals, sort of develop all these new options, try and find new solutions, and try and make our cities and suburbs a little bit more sustainable. So, you know, it's a passion for me, but it's also very challenging to see how limited sometimes those options can be for a lot of Torontonians and a lot of people everywhere. So the topic of equity and access and affordability is a very pressing issue, especially with Toronto, that has some of the longest commutes in North America. So I was so pleased to be able to moderate this session this evening. And so I've mentioned our speakers today, but I'm going to introduce our first speaker and just get it going right away. So our first speaker is Patricia Burke-Wood. She is geography professor at York University, and she has a focus on citizenship, activism, governance, and particularly the experiences of marginalized groups. So Patricia is also an urban affairs columnist for Spacing Toronto. So you might have seen her columns there, lots of interesting articles that you can go and check out anytime as well online. So Patricia, without further ado, if you'd like to join us and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Great, thanks very much. I'm really pleased that this conversation about affordable transportation and why it's important is happening, particularly with the impacts of the pandemic, and I'm really honored to be part of it. I was advised that we should all be as positive and inspiring as possible. I'm not sure I'm going to be super positive, but I'll try and be passionate and turn my anger towards a good cause. My starting place, which is why I'm so interested in the topic of this panel, is that urban mobility is fundamentally a question of social justice. It's a question of topography and engineering and other things too, but fundamentally urban mobility is a question of social justice. It's about equity and access to the city and our economic and social well-being. Mobility is necessarily at the heart of urban economies and societies, so its affordability is important. And affordability is about relative value and relative cost. We can measure it in money, and we should, but we can measure it in other costs, and I think that's important and relative to the eco-fare as a whole. We can measure it in terms of our time, in terms of our health and well-being and that of our environment, our access to opportunity, our sense of dignity and belonging, because anytime we give any of these up, that's a cost to us. So I'm concerned about, in an ongoing way, about the many ways in which Toronto's transportation infrastructure as a whole is unaffordable to many, and relatively speaking, in many instances, actually isn't very good value. You know, on the most obvious front, the daily transit fare is high enough to make a serious dent in a household budget in Toronto. And there is also very little effort on the part of the city to bring it within reach of people with low income. We do have a discounted fare program that takes $32.75 off the price of a monthly pass. And that lower price is still higher than the regular price of a monthly pass in Montreal. And in case all that wasn't miserly enough, the city suspended new applications to this program when the pandemic began, just as many people's incomes were hit. We in fact have the highest monthly pass in North America, and we need a much better, more accessible program to bring transit within, you know, financial reach of many people in this city. But reducing fares isn't the only or necessarily the most effective way to make transit more affordable. We also need to do more to prioritize transit over private vehicles so that we can reduce travel time and distances. We tend to treat transit riders' time like it isn't worth anything. We do studies of the cost of congestion, the billions of dollars of people's time wasted sitting in traffic. We tend to do those studies about drivers and the imagined value of their time, and we don't do the same kind of justice to transit riders' time or cyclist time or pedestrians' time. And transportation infrastructure in this city is also unaffordable in many ways in terms of health and safety. It is disproportionately and unnecessarily dangerous to walk and cycle in this city, and we are absolutely not doing enough to address that. Our Vision Zero program is extremely limited and remains unambitious, given the cost. And our transportation infrastructure as a whole is also unaffordable in terms of dignity and belonging for a lot of people. We allow the police to disturb the enjoyment of a lot of people, particularly racialized people, even just who want to go for a walk in the evening. Cyclists are more vulnerable to traffic stop if they are also Black or brown, and they are more vulnerable in those traffic stops. We tend to worry more about fare evasion than increasing ridership on transit, and we disproportionately police fare payment by racialized people and young people, particularly students. And overall, we do very little to encourage and welcome and incentivize transit use. Relative to what we spend on accommodating cars, we do very little to encourage the use of public space for walking and cycling. We have streets with narrow sidewalks, we have streets without sidewalks, we have parks on streets without sidewalks. I always wonder what that says about our concern for children's safety. We also allow our streets and sidewalks and transit infrastructure to remain inaccessible to people with physical disabilities. And we unjustly reduce their mobility and thus their right to all the opportunities the city has to offer. But what I've been talking about so far is individual affordability. And when I think about affordability, I also always think about collective affordability. We do have many people in this city who have pretty much unhindered mobility. There's no financial obstacle for them to any form of transportation. There's no spatial constraint, nothing. But these people, research tells us, are the most likely to drive cars and to use cars as their primary or default mode of mobility. Individually, they can afford it, but as a city and a society, collectively, we can't. It costs us. We give up space for roads and space within roads. We have parking space that could be put to better economic use. We pave surfaces that could instead help us absorb rainwater. We kill 250,000 children between the ages of 5 and 14 every year with cars worldwide. It's the leading cause of death for that age group. We pollute our air and contribute to the incidence of asthma, which is the leading cause of the hospitalization of children in this province. Cars add to the CO2 in the atmosphere, and private vehicles and transportation are a big chunk of rising CO2 levels, which intensify the warming of the planet and accompanying climate change, which leads directly, in the case of Toronto, to heat-induced illness and to increased rainfall and consequent flooding, whose cumulative costs are now in the billions. We can't afford this. Transit and active transportation are what we can afford collectively and where we need to invest. Private automobiles are unaffordable. For a healthy and equitable and just city where everyone can thrive, we must ensure that public space and transit and active transportation are affordable to all individuals. And that means within reach in terms of income, but also in terms of time, accessibility, health and safety, and dignity and belonging. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia. That's so great. It is always exciting to be reading your articles and how critical they are. So very happy to talk about the issues, and we're definitely going to be getting into it this evening. But hopefully, you'll see with the other speakers as well that there are some great ideas out there if we can only implement them. And our next speaker actually is one of those people working on some very inspiring both research as well as active projects. So Naomi Imberber is a public space fellow with the Bentway Conservancy. She's a Black public health researcher and uses data to push forward conversations of justice and health equity. So currently acting as the public space fellow at Bentway, she's striving to bring her passion to all projects that she works in, which have included those at the Center for Active Transportation, the Wellesley Institute, and Black Lives Matter Toronto. So Naomi, please feel free to come on and provide a presentation for everyone here. Thank you so much.
Hi, thanks for that great intro, Adrian. It's as if I wrote it myself. And also thank you so much, Patricia. Hearing your words, there are so many aspects of what you said that I echo all of the time in my work, whether that's about transportation and mobility being inherently a social justice issue, or thinking about affordability broadly and not just an individual affordability. So thanks so much for such a great introductory chat. So I'm just going to be sharing my screen for a moment and just showing a couple of slides that I want to talk about really briefly to kind of introduce how I think about equity and access and affordability for transportation. So something that I always like to do is kind of ground people who are listening to me in kind of the questions that I think about and that I think are really important to start in terms of these discussions. So as Kim mentioned, I'm calling in from Toronto, Treaty 13 territory, and I encourage everybody who's listening to think about the place that they are now and who they think the transportation system was built for. And on the flip side, who it was not built for. Because fundamentally, when we're thinking about equity and access, it's really easy to understand for whom these systems are inaccessible when we think about who they were built for. And again, thinking about how I see access. So my current working definition, and this often changes and evolves, is the ability to engage with a person, place, opportunity, service, or anything of that nature, because your needs are acknowledged and accounted for. And when I think about equity, I think about the I think about the state in which we are, I think, on this panel and EcoFair in general are striving for, in which everyone has fair and full access to opportunities without disadvantage due to their race, ability, or any other aspect of their identity. So I really encourage, again, people who are listening to think about what their definitions of equity and access are and how that really translates to affordable transportation systems and also the fight for climate change and climate justice in general. So the kind of things that I think about when I think about affordable transportation is to think about all the different types of transportation modes that I think people default to when I think of urban settings. And these are not exhaustive. But we think about walking and cycling and public transport, as well as private car use, because sometimes that is the most accessible mean of transportation for everybody. But if we think on the flip side about what that means to have equity and access, we can think about the different types of barriers that exist for people, whether that's icy sidewalks, whether that's a lack of bike lanes, or even reduced service. And when we think about those barriers, we can see very clearly what those mean for the people who actually are using these transportation systems. So these are just a couple of examples, but when we think about a lack of public transportation service in areas such as Scarborough here in Toronto, and what that means for people who are hoping to get to where they need to get to safely in a pandemic, or on the flip side, what it means for the city to be going about implementing a curb TO plan that may inadvertently and without potentially enough forethought, be blocking access for people with disabilities. So again, echoing what Patricia said about what it means that we are blocking access and mobility for folks with physical disabilities. And as somebody who, while I'm currently a public space fellow at the Bentway, I come from a public health background, I think about all of the ways in which this impacts our health. So if we're thinking about the fact that we don't have equity, we don't have accessibility for equity-seeking groups such as recent immigrants, what does that mean for unwalkable neighborhoods and the risk of diabetes long-term, as well as some other chronic illnesses? Additionally, just again, as Patricia had said, about the types of motor vehicle collisions we see in children. And then finally, asthma rates because of high car use in certain cities such as Windsor, Ontario. So those are the kinds of things that I think I'm coming into this conversation with, my definitions of equity and access and the way those impact our health. And again, I encourage everybody to think about who those transportations were built for, wherever they are, and finally, why it matters to be talking about this today. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Naomi. Yeah, it is so great to be able to look at some of the research that you've done and kind of tie it together as well with our own experiences, being able to be in a place and look around and think, really, who is this? When you look at a service or something, who is this built for? I often think about that when you get to a bus stop and there's no pad or anything. It's sometimes in like 2 feet of snow. So thank you for sharing that with us. Another sort of great mover and shaker in Toronto is Darnell Harris. So our next speaker, he is the executive director at Our Greenway. So he is a planner and community advocate focused on breaking down barriers to mobility for all ages and abilities in Toronto's Northwest. He has a passion for space animation, mobility, sustainability, and he has forwarded research and facilitated dialogue towards advancing equitable and dignified mobility. So please welcome Darnell. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. I certainly appreciate the perfect segue. Let me see here. So going on the subject of what is something built for? For people who are not familiar with Toronto, this is a map of the city of Toronto, which showcases where the walkability is, where the low income spaces are, and where the towers are. And what you notice is almost all the areas that have towers that are low income are in our suburbs. Now, these places are the places in the city that also has, as I said, the lowest income. And our Mobility Greenway work is taking place in Northwest Toronto, where there's a huge amount, as you can see, of towers and low-income people. Now, the 3 projects to the south there, the Winchwood Barns, where EcoFair grew out of, the Brickworks, and the Bendway. These are 3 projects that took place, as you notice, in pretty close convergence within downtown Toronto. And I want you to look at all of these projects as, in one way or another, acts of political resistance. What do I mean? We'll get back to that in a second. Now, we've been asked, why are we trying to do this in Northwest Toronto? Well, this is why. This is the cargo cycle, for example, in Duke Heights, which is one of the industrial areas. And to move around the suburbs, you have goods, you have families, you need to move around, you have things you need to carry. A cargo bike like that, therefore, makes a lot of sense within a suburban area. This video on the right here is Finch. And here's what it feels like if you happen to be up there. Now, there's no bike lanes now on this road, for one. There's some discussion about building some lanes where that shadow is. And the question is, would you want your kid there? Would you want to be there yourself? Would you want your grandmother there? Or would you not be concerned they would be ending up under the wheels of that 18-wheeler, which, considering these are industrial areas that power the local economy, is not an unlikely occurrence. So that's why we've proposed a greenway, which would make use of both the natural assets as well as the places where people travel. In terms of, specifically, you have the Jane and Finch, the right there. To the left, you have Albion Mall, and you have, again, it tries to address those towers. Now, why would this matter? Well, you can hop on a bike and move on something that's wheeled 4 to 5 times faster than you can walk. So imagine the difference if you're at Jane and Finch, which is out here in this corner, and Albion Mall or Rexdale, which are other key communities within Northwest Toronto. Imagine being able to get there with half a ton of goods within 25 minutes, without a car, without a truck. It makes a huge difference to the local economy, people's lives, and allows us to actually address a more sustainable future. What could this look like? Something like this. Now, there's both a spring scene and a winter scene here, and I want to stress something important. Usually when we look at renderings and we see them, they tend to be of, unrealistic expectations and situations. But what we have here is a situation that you might find, both very comforting and familiar. And I want to stress, more importantly, how simple this space is. Why? Because, it's what it is. It's a fire pit. It's some benches. It's some simple covering. It's some lights. It's some places to park your bike. It's some, flat vending area. It makes a difference. But it feels comfortable because there are trees flourishing, because you have rain gardens. You're separated from this heavy traffic. Usually it's amazing. In renderings, you never see heavy traffic. So we're trying to showcase that here. And of course, considering it's near winter, what would this feel like in winter? Again, it feels inviting and it feels cozy. And it brings home just some important realities about the spaces that we happen to live in are deeply affected by the way in which we care for them and use for them. And the main difference is we don't care and use spaces outside of the affluent core as we do here. Now, I was speaking to political resistance earlier. This picture here is a picture of the brickworks, sorry, not the brickworks, the art barns at Burke-Wood and St. Clair about 25 years ago. It was slated for demolition in 1996. Then the community here, which is one of the most affluent and educated in the country, engaged in 6 years of outreach, fundraising of millions of dollars and engagement. And then you had a grand opening. 12 years later, money, political capital, city staff support. This couldn't have happened without any of that. Now, if you go back to the map that I had earlier, with the brickworks and with the Bentway, in both cases, and in a lot of these projects, you have the same convergence. In the case of the Bentway, there was large donation. In the case of Evergreen Brickworks, there were condos that were going to go there, which were fought and fought and fought until eventually the space was able to be managed by Evergreen, which has stewarded this place ever since. Now, going back to the question which closed the last segment, who gets built, when and where, this took 12 years. We've now at our Greenway been at what we've been doing for about 5 years. And the question is, of course, unlike communities in the core that can very easily manage, communities in the core that can very easily manage to, well, easier, find the money or find the space or find the time to be able to actually pursue this. It's very important that, there are opportunities now for these communities to be able to do that. Otherwise, we're going to keep having assets, community assets built in communities who are the most privileged across our cities. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Darnell. That is a great comparison of the barns and how they came about, and how community can get together. It's much easier for some than others, but I do love our Greenway initiative, and I hope we can dig into it and some of the cross references between our other speakers as well in our Q&A. So I'm going to present or give a little intro to our last speaker. So Tarane Zarin is a volunteer with Free Transit Toronto, and they identify she, her, and she's a recent PhD grad from University of Toronto, and yes, volunteering with Free Transit Toronto, an organization local. So she is a scientist and an artist, and very passionate about sustainable and just mobility. So hopefully we can have her come on and tell us a little bit more about that, because it's very exciting.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Thanks so much for having me on, and it's been really insightful, as always, to hear the other speakers who I've had the pleasure of hearing at other events. So hi everyone, I'm Adrian. As Adrian said, I'm a volunteer with Free Transit Toronto, which is the campaign for free and accessible public transit in Toronto. You may have never heard of this organization, so I'll just spend a few minutes giving you a little bit of background on the group and myself. So I'm actually a scientist by day, but I've been a patron of the TTC since I was 6 years old. And so I noticed fairly early on the important role that it plays in our city, and also that it could stand some improvements, particularly in terms of accessibility and fairness. I joined Free Transit Toronto after stumbling across some of their materials back in 2013, and I've been participating in the group ever since. So Free Transit Toronto is a small but dedicated group of volunteers who believe in a simple concept, which is that fare free public transit should be a right for everyone, just like libraries, public education, and healthcare. And so our actions are mostly focused on introducing the idea of free public transit to the people of Toronto. And most members of the group are involved in and lend support to other movements in the city that focus on anti-privatization, freezing and reduction of transit fares, and anti-poverty measures. So some of the groups that we work with are TTC Riders, the Fair Fare Coalition, which is now part of TTC Riders, Scarborough Transit Action, JFAP, or Jane and Finch Action Against Poverty. And more recently, we've been trying to reach out to other, even more groups in Toronto who are interested in pushing for free transit, such as Climate Justice Toronto, and Courage, and so on. So if you're interested in any more background about our group, or you want to read some of the literature that we've produced, you can visit freetransittoronto.org, join our Facebook group, or follow us on Twitter at freetransitto. So just in a couple of minutes, I'm going to try to give you a small flavor of why fares are bad and why we should be moving towards free public transit. And the main point that I would like you to consider is that free transit is much more than fare-free transit. And, you know, free transit is obviously, yes, about getting rid of fares, but it's also about dissociating transit from policing and surveillance, decommodifying transit, and expanding its reach and accessibility in collaboration with the communities that it is meant to serve. So why free public transit? I feel like Patricia really went into this in detail, so I'll just quickly repeat that a TTC Metro Pass costs $156 and change. It's one of the most expensive transit passes in the world. A senior student or low-income person, and as Tricia mentioned, that low-income program is on hold at the moment, would get a measly $30 discount, which brings the cost of the pass down to $128 a month. This is a huge purchase to make. And so if you consider getting rid of this price, consider how incredible it would be to have universal mobility, which instead of being paid with these user fees, could be paid for by progressive taxes that do not penalize people with low incomes. And so a related point, as I mentioned, is decommodification. So currently when you ride the TTC, you're constantly referred to as a customer. And sadly, this somewhat makes sense with our current fare structure because you're paying at this point of entry for the product of moving from one place to another. And so just like purchasing any other product, you know, whenever you're considering riding the TTC somewhere, maybe you're doing a lot of mental math to see whether it's worth it or not. and again, this also Patricia touched on as well, but fares can really limit, because of this, can really limit the parts of the city that are accessible to you. For example, if you live in Scarborough and you really want to check out an event downtown, you have to factor in, let's say, $6 and change that it takes to get there and back. You may call that an unnecessary expenditure and just forget about it. Or riding the TTC to get groceries, is the $6 worth it? Or maybe you just have to try to walk several trips back and forth. So again, you can imagine many different scenarios: job interviews, going to school, going to work. All these different things are things that you have to factor in to see if they're worth that high price. So another point that I want to touch on is that free public transit would mean no fare police. And so we've all been, touched or educated about the Black Lives Matter movement that has been going on in the last few months and much longer before that. So with free transit, fare inspectors would be abolished. And so people would not have to worry about being harassed. And transit staff as well, like bus drivers and train operators, would not have to worry about collecting fares, which is also a hugely stressful part of their jobs. And so people, particularly racialized people in Toronto, are harassed and intimidated daily by fare inspectors and bus drivers. And we've heard some of the more famous stories around this. For example, the Black teenager who was pinned to the ground on the St. Clair streetcar. But if you ride any of the proof of purchase routes on the TTC, you can see that harassment by fare inspectors and even transit operators is a daily occurrence. So we have to ask ourselves why we're using our public resources to crack down on people who are using public transit. In case you're not aware, the fine for not paying a fare in Toronto is over $200, and it requires you to go to court, usually causing you to miss work. So someone who decided to ride the bus one day can be fined double or triple the amount of someone who decided to speed their car and endanger someone's life on the road. So, let's take a step back and realize that fare evaders are not endangering anyone. They're simply trying to move through the city, and often they can't afford to pay the fare. So let's take back our public spaces, stop penalizing people for taking public transit, and really ensure that these places welcome everyone instead of reinforcing existing systemic biases through policing and surveillance of transit users. Just a couple other things to touch on is that free transit would result in a surge in ridership, which in the grand scheme of things, we can all agree is a good thing. So we've seen this in other cities, as well as in our own city's limited experience with free public transit. In case you're not aware, riding the TTC is free for children who are 12 and under in Toronto. So for example, the largest city in the world that has free public transit is Tallinn in Estonia. They implemented fare-free public transit for local residents in 2013. And their experience has been so successful that they've now rolled it out across the country and are the largest free transit zone in the world. And finally, just because this is also about sustainability, of course, we have to mention that with a surge in ridership will come a reduced dependence on private motor vehicles, which is a key component of the fight against climate change. as well as the often talked about gridlock that our city faces. So there's no question that public transit is the answer to, or one of the answers to sustainable mobility, especially in cities. Because just as a very simple example, even if you consider 30 electric cars with 1 or 2 people in them, that's still 30 cars on the road versus a bus, a streetcar, or a subway that can carry many more people in a much more space efficient way. So yeah, those are kind of my points to consider around free public transit, and I'm excited to discuss more in the discussion period. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Taranae. That is, yeah, it is a smaller group. I've followed along with TTC riders for a few years now, and the advocacy and ideas that come out of that have always been really interesting. But doing background research, it's been so great to understand more of the depth of what free transit can really bring to a city, any city, including Toronto, and also what that really unlocks. So for this next section, we're going to take all these great ideas from what everyone has presented on equity and access and affordability, and we're going to have a little discussion because it's online. It's sometimes a little awkward to try and interject over, but hopefully we will have a fairly normal discussion where we can all get to talking. So if everyone wants to turn on their camera,
it's been disabled.
We can at least see each other a little bit easier. And we do actually have a number of questions that are coming in. So, I have some questions of my own, and I'm sure you guys actually have some comments for each other. But I was actually hoping we could kick it off with a user or a audience question. So this first question was really, if there's anything that we've taken away from 2020 and how things have changed so much, is that so much of what we thought was not possible before this year is now, everything's different, everything's changed. So you can see on our streets that there's all these new programs. This person was asking specifically about active TO, but I think it actually relates as well to transit and how we just called off fare for a few months on the TTC as well. So both active TO and TTC, how can we make some of those things permanent now that we've actually seen with our own eyes that these programs can work and things don't fall apart immediately. And yeah, so I guess continuing on some of the lessons learned from this year, if there's any big lessons. I'll pick on Patricia first, just because it's been so long since she's spoken.
Thanks. I'll need you to repeat some of that though, because I was struggling with technical difficulties.
That's okay. Just there was a great user question or audience question, basically asking, can we salvage something from 2020? There's so many things that we've learned and so many things that I think we got to test drive this year in terms of free transit, active TO, quiet streets, all these different things. How could we continue that forward? And I just like any of your thoughts, even if they don't relate to the things that I listed there.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think one of the things we've discovered is how quickly we can also make these transformations when we're motivated, not just in Toronto, but other cities. Not only have been making commitments to things like more cycling lanes, but also moving the whole process forward a lot more quickly. And we've opened up a lot more public space. I think in Toronto, people have also recognized the value of public space. I liked what Darnell was saying about, very ordinary space and the many uses it can be put to. The pandemic has really brought that home, and we know we're facing more of this, and I hope it will. I hope one of the things we can salvage is the value of really accessible public space, really accessible forms of public mobility, like cycling lanes, like transit, you know, and the importance of really making it welcome and accessible for everyone. I hope we keep some of this and don't close it down afterwards.
That's great thoughts. Just to help facilitate, Naomi, did you want to add anything? You looked like you wanted to.
I guess I was nodding. But yeah, I guess just to like echo a bit of what Patricia said about the speed in which we've implemented things, and that political will, specifically thinking about now what was the impetus for this newfound political will, for what communities were calling out for more bike lanes, and certain routes, who were the people that had the power to make sure that they had enough service, TTC service, to be able to properly physically distance. So again, kind of just, I know that I'm like almost like repeating myself, but thinking about who are we thinking about for this new COVID transportation system, and why was it now that we were able to implement these things, I think is really important moving forward. Because I think if we have had any lessons from this time, it's that we do have the will, we do have the resources. And if we have the same desire to provide those resources for the folks who have been traditionally pushed out of the transportation systems, we'll be on a really good path of discussion to make these changes sustainable for everybody.
That's great. Darnell, did you? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, certainly two things. One, just speaking of what Naomi just said, you know, the reality of, yes, the city moved quickly. Where did they move quickly? Pretty well, almost all downtown. You know, there were a couple of routes in the Northwest, which I went on, but that's pretty well it. Most of the other programs were concentrated on the core. Now, you know, if there's something I hope we learn from this, is when we speak about transit, we tend to default to mass transit. They're not the same thing. And, you know, one of the realities well before COVID is that moving with a bus, and this is just a reality of mass transit provision in particular, is that when you have a suburban space, people and destinations are naturally spread out. There are a couple of core roads, but it was built like that, where there's lots of space between your start and your finish. The reality is, usually, getting on a bike is going to be much faster than getting on a bus. One day when I was in York, I went to Jane and Finch. I was going to bike. My mother told me not to, so I took the bus. It took me 45 minutes for what should have taken me 13 by bike. It would be helpful if we could think less, and this would also, you know, help the whole transit discussion in general. Think less of transit as automatically mass transit, when we could think of transit as, how do we get people to where they need to go? It costs $1 million plus Canadian dollars to buy a single bus. For that cost, we could buy 100 cargo bikes, put them as bike libraries in the basement of the many canaverous buildings, which are required to have huge parking lots that don't get used. And we'd probably have better transit service for many of those people than can be provided by that one bus, for example. Because, you know, the reality is 70% plus of trips every single day in our communities are within the community, whereas transit is very good if you're leaving the community and going somewhere else. It would help the efficiency of the transit system if people had functional ways to get around their community, instead of being shuttled on to the bus that take it a couple of stops because they're carrying their groceries and otherwise it's too heavy.
Taranae, did you want to add anything just to that last thought before we move on?
Just echoing what everyone said. I was also kind of in the northeast of Toronto during the bulk of the sort of first 6 months of the pandemic. And yeah, there was no active TO there. And, you know, we kind of know that a lot of these, like the bus lanes, the rapid bus lanes, for example, for Gin and Finch were promised for like next year or something, and people are still sort of crowding on a lot of those bus routes. So yeah, just thinking about where those quick changes happened, I think is helpful. But knowing that quick changes are possible is also great.
Yeah, it is a little bit frustrating to see Toronto, especially I think Toronto in particular is a city where we tend to grind along really slowly. But actually you guys spoke on, touched a really good couple of points there. So one is the crowding on the TTC right now, and specifically the buses. So one thing that, you know, there's been a number of articles, possibly one that I read in Spacing, about the bounce back of TTC, and it is coming back much faster on buses than it is on the subway. And of course, bus service is what most people rely on if they are outside of the core. As far as crowding and transit service going on outside of the core, you know, some people are asking, should I just stay away from transit to try and give people space? Specifically around Darnell and Naomi, around active transportation as an alternative to TTC. And then also, I wouldn't mind hearing from Patricia and Terene on sort of the potential for lack of income from TTC and what that means down the road. But maybe we can start with Darnell and just talk a bit about what you were talking about before, active transportation. Oh, you just muted. Just one. Yeah. There we go.
Then maybe it'd be good if we could hear from one of the other speakers first, and then I can cycle back to that if it helps.
Certainly, yeah. So Naomi, maybe you could share a little bit about your work with TCAT and the limitations for active transportation, especially as such a good tool of getting around in areas outside of the subways and the streetcar lands.
Yeah, so a lot of my work with TCAT and a lot of the work that TCAT still has going on is looking at suburbs specifically, so looking outside the downtown core. As people have already touched on, we have a lot of active transportation infrastructure within the downtown core, whether that's bike lanes, protected or unprotected, as well as Bike Share Toronto. I mean, sometimes I can't even walk a couple of seconds in the downtown core without seeing another Bike Share Toronto stop, which is intentional and great. But when we think about outside of the downtown core, some of the issues about trying to encourage people to use other means besides private car use is that there simply is no infrastructure. And also, whether that's bike lanes or things like that, of introducing a culture in which people feel safe on the roads. It's not enough just to put in a bike lane if there are still high traffic speeds, if there's still just a general lack of awareness towards cyclists or pedestrians as well that makes people feel unsafe. It doesn't matter if there's one bike lane down one road, people will still not buy into active transportation. So work that TCAT does is, and we've been doing some research in Markham specifically around equity-seeking groups and infrastructure within Markham, as well as the current bike hub, which is called Markham Cycles, that allows youth that come from particularly recent immigrant or low-income communities access to like bike workshops to see how they can upcycle bikes that have been used before, or just other general cycling knowledge. So I think when we talk about active transportation use and having that be a viable option for people, of course, there has to be an investment in the infrastructure, but there also has to be kind of investment in the community to make it feel like it's a viable option for them.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, from our perspective, for example, we don't use the word cyclist. We also don't use the word pedestrian or driver at our Greenway. because none of those things actually exist. They're planning terms that are meant to refer to how you're using something. But are you three different people because you walked out of your house this morning, got on your bike and then got into a car at a certain point for work? Or are you one person simply making different practical choices as that day went on? So, from our perspective, certainly why we've been focusing on having those rain gardens is so that people could be comfortable, but also as a practical reason. If you look at a bike share bike is not a practical choice for a certain reality, which is to say, it is useful if you happen to have nothing to carry, no kids to come with you, and I really hope you don't have a purse, because it's probably going to fall out of the front of that, the front of that tray. Been there, done that. Certainly part of the reason we've been focusing on cargo bikes is because they have a very practical reality of being able to hold kids, hold groceries, and meet a suburban context better. So the way that we tend to discuss transit as opposed to mass transit is within a toolbox of mobility. You want to get around, great, wonderful. If you're, carrying a ton, an actual ton, you should probably have a truck. If you're going, in a far distance on the highway, you should probably be using a car. And apart from that, you should probably be using a cargo bike or something along those lines. So, rather than have this sort of cultural pressure, which is what cyclists and driver does, it's much better just instead to say, look, what do you need to do on the day that you need to do it? How can we connect you with what you need?
This is great. I'm realizing that we have some questions populating from the audience. Thanks so much, guys. So I'll turn to try and address some of those. So one of the great questions that was submitted was sort of how, beyond just cost, can we make public transit more accessible, specifically to people with mobility issues? And that definitely, when a friend had a baby and had to get around with a baby, it suddenly became very obvious to her, stepping from one world completely into another, trying to use transit. Maybe Patricia or Naomi, do you guys want to look like you might have some ideas there?
Yeah, sure, I can start. The physical accessibility is an important question. The TTC is moving slowly but steadily towards making all of its stations accessible, which for the most part involves, or the most significant part, the introduction of elevators to access subway platforms. But even in your comments, you mentioned earlier about, waiting for a bus and whether the area is cleared or whether there's appropriate shelter there, or a shelter which you can still see whether the bus is coming, those fundamental things. And again, about accessibility in terms of time, the TTC has begun to introduce at some bus stops, indications of next bus information that's just there on a rolling screen rather than something you have to dial into. More of that would be helpful. We have a general situation though where we're just not prioritizing space for transit. So making it more accessible is also about that question of time, so that it's realistic for people to take it and manageable. We do have a Wheel-Trans system, which in most cases is works very well for people, but the normal standard major system should be more accessible for everyone, and that includes all of the things that Tarana mentioned too, in terms of surveillance and policing and so on as well.
Yeah, there's no shortage of resources directing at enforcement instead of service and accessibility.
Yeah, there's no replacement, frankly, just for better service. More frequent service, more buses that reduce crowding. Anybody who's pushed a stroller or used a walker or used a chair knows that crowding is often one of the reasons they can't get on the bus.
So true. Related question, a little bit in terms of enforcement, just because I think it is such an important issue that came out of the Black Lives Matter protests, of how transportation intersects with this. You know, for transit to be a safe space, you know, how could TTC be making those changes? And I was thinking of starting with Taranay just to comment a little bit on that a little bit further, just because you did introduce some great ideas there.
Yeah, I mean, the TTC until recently did not have fare inspectors. That could obviously be a first step, would be just to go back to not having fare inspectors. But I think it's important to realize that beyond the fare inspectors, you know, there are other sort of forces of policing and surveillance on the TTC. And in addition to that, just like this idea that the fare it's kind of used as leverage to police people, and it just doesn't need to be that way. And we've sort of been conditioned to think that that's just the way it is, but it really doesn't have to be that way. And we have to, you know, really dissociate public services from these sort of, these forms of surveillance and policing.
Can I just add something? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. No, I was just going to encourage you.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, additionally to what Taranay just said, I think specifically in terms of TTC inspectors on public transit, I think if we fundamentally think of transit as a good to be policed, as this sort of exclusionary type of service in which certain people should be excluded for whatever the reason, whether that's not they're paying the fare because of how they look. And if we decide as a society that is the case, then we're going to have over policing of certain people, of certain identities. And we see that with Black and brown people on transit systems all of the time, when it is decided that they should be policed because they don't have the right to that public service, when already in their everyday lives, it's been decided they don't have the right to every other thing. They don't have the right to freely be in space. They don't have the right to walk down the street without being profiled. So I think the TTC and fare inspection is a small microcosm of only just the larger system, obviously. But it is a really good example of what does it mean that we think that this service should be policed? And what does that say about us if we think that that's how we should be approaching transit?
Did anyone else want to join in on this and just keep it rolling? Because I think we're into a very rich area here.
I think if you move on to the next question, maybe we can double back to this one during that.
So just continuing on transit a little bit, Taranay, you must get this question a lot. You know, how would one fund transit? So without sort of spending all of our remaining time, if you just want to touch on how some of these other concepts work to enlighten us, that would be great.
Sure. I'm going to keep it short and just say it's about priorities. We fund a lot of things. Like we live in one of the richest countries in the world, and we have a lot of ways of sort of, for example, taxing the wealthy, or, you know, not directing resources to subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. Just there are so many things that we could be doing differently. Not funding $1 billion development of Presto, for example. Lots of different things. For more ideas, we have a list of things online that you can check out.
Amazing. That's so helpful. Sure, go ahead, Patricia.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, it frustrates me so much that we see transit as a cost, when in fact transit pays us back in the overall urban economy. But cars actually do cost us. So the question is always, how would we pay for public transit? And the question really should be, how is it that we are paying for this automobility? Where is that money coming from? And we're paying the cost financially sometimes, but also in all these other ways. But in terms of increased mobility leads to increased economic participation, leads to increased wealth, leads to an increased tax base. Like it actually funds itself. We just have to stop seeing it as transit as this isolated thing. And I think the pandemic ought to be teaching us a little bit about how these things are connected, the same way that we can appreciate that, you know, keeping people healthy is essential to keeping the economy running as well, right? So keeping people moving in an urban economy is essential to our economic well-being. We would actually improve the economy by increasing this mobility, because one of the things we would absolutely do with increased mobility through reduced or free fare transit is increased economic participation, particularly for people at lower incomes.
Can I just add one thing also, Patricia, is that the same way that we have these economic kind of conversations around transit that are a little backwards, because as you said, it does pay for itself. As somebody who's in the public health field, it pays itself in those ways as well. I mean, besides just this specific moment, or what feels like a forever never-ending moment of this pandemic, the ways that increased mobility, accessible mobility, aids in people's health and well-being. If you didn't have to spend 2 hours a day going to work, what would that do for your health and well-being? How would those costs in our healthcare system also fund itself? I think it's often, we talk about fields such as transportation or planning and public health separately, but if this pandemic has shown us everything, I think public health is central to all of these different types of conversation. And again, to the conversation about why is it that we're not funding affordable public transit?
You know, just specifically, I guess, to the question of efficiency, however, the challenge with anything that you make free is that people want to use it. Now that's fine. But what you also get is you don't necessarily want people who want to walk one block getting on the bus, because then that slows down the system and it's not really what you're seeking to achieve. So at the same time, it's a matter of giving people choices by, you know, within your local community, being able to make it workable and comfortable to be able to take your bike or your mobility device. It does not involve getting on that bus for a short period. So therefore, you can make the most logical, comfortable choice within that toolbox. You know, within a local location, you're going to say, great, why should I be waiting for a bus when I could just hop on my bike and go to my friend's house and go to the park? If you're going a further distance, then in that way, you know, it also helps for that matter. There's the woman who's asking about regarding her baby. Well, that means you have a bigger pram. That means you're probably, you know, you're possibly waiting for another bus because there's no space on that bus there. And that's why giving more people to move around the local community will also make transit more efficient and cheaper to run.
Yeah,
oh, go ahead.
Oh,
yeah,
sorry. Can I just touch on that? Yeah, like I think all of these things should work together, obviously. And that's something that the sort of logical use of transit, I think, is something that we should get away from, maybe, because choice is about like real choice. So like if you did choose to just hop on the bus because you just want to hop on the bus, then you should be able to hop on a bus for one stop one day, and that you shouldn't have to calculate how like illogical that would be.
Yeah, I was just going to add that TTC is pretty unique in that it has very, very little outside funding. So it has about 2/3 typically recovery at the fare box, and the rest of the funding is mostly through the City of Toronto, a tiny bit through the province, through the building, the construction, that sort of thing, and new buses. But by and large, Toronto has very, very little funding. There was a really interesting Vox video that just came out around why American transit sucks, and they used Toronto as a good example, not realizing that we were far worse than they were for funding. all this to say, as far as sort of getting out of COVID and sort of seeing a recovery for everyone, like an equitable recovery and building back better into that degree, how do you guys see, transit and infrastructure, transportation in general, kind of helping that? Certain, initiatives you'd like to see? We could have a few ideas from each of you. That'd be great. Go ahead.
I'll throw one out. I'd like to see a bridge over the 400 to Finch. Right now, for example, there was a man, Giuseppe Pellegrino. He died a couple of days ago, about last month, because in order to get across on a bike on Finch through the cloverleaf, you have to survive 2 right turns and hope you don't get plowed into by a truck. He unfortunately was not so fortunate. Now that bridge would cost probably about 10 million or so to build, roughly. And, I think of that at the same time. I think of the fact that three brand new bridges are currently making their way to Toronto to go to the waterfront. And it just keeps bringing us back to the question of what gets built, where and for whom. Because this 400 has been in place for how many decades now? And there's yet to be a bridge over there.
Thanks. Naomi, did you want to add a little bit around the recovery of different people coming back from COVID and hardship? How transportation plays a role in that?
Sure. I guess when we're thinking about recovery in general, I would really implore everybody to think about who's going to recover quickly and who has the resources to recover from the pandemic, who has the resources to sustain themselves during the pandemic, whether that's to start driving more if they don't feel comfortable on public transit, or buy a fancy $2,000 bike to get around places. I cycle too. That's not a dig at cycling. It's just to know that there is a cost sometimes associated with cycling if you want to invest in it. But what I would say is that something that I feel like I've noticed both in public health and transportation pre-COVID that I really hope doesn't happen during COVID is the way that we evaluate these different initiatives that we've begun to roll out. So there's been obviously a really enhanced and quick process to do things like active TO and curb TO and other TOs. And when we think about the communities that don't have those resources now, and who may not be using them as extensively because historically they've been pushed out of these types of transportation modes, I would really be critical about how we evaluate it. Even if one of the bike share stations in North York isn't getting used as often as their downtown core, are there other factors? What does it mean about just the general landscape and situation? Because one thing that I really hope doesn't happen is that we start to come to conclusions that people in low-income communities just don't bike, or just don't walk to places, or just don't do this, or just don't do that because of the way we evaluate, and without looking at contextualizing the transportation experiences. So moving forward, I think being really critical about the different types of resources that we're putting into communities, and making sure that we're not doing them in isolation and without recognizing the general transportation context.
Great. Patricia, did you want to share some thoughts on sort of COVID-19 recovery and an equitable return to transportation?
Yeah, absolutely. Transit's absolutely essential to the city's economic recovery, particularly when we think of who's been hardest hit, both in terms of health and economically by the pandemic. It's disproportionately women, and particularly women with children, and it's disproportionately racialized communities. These are also communities who dominate transit ridership. We also cannot replace transit ridership with automobile use and put the cars anywhere or deal with the resulting traffic. the urban economy requires everybody to move. The only way to do that efficiently is transit, and the best way to help those communities most affected by this. And I would add actually seniors to that too. I mean, although there's been a significant death toll, you still have the majority of seniors surviving it, but we know that there are long-term health issues and so on. So, you know, all these communities that will still need to move, and the way that you can support them and their recovery is through transit support. And as you noted, yes, 70% of the TTC's revenue relies on the fare box, which is the highest in North America and probably in the world for publicly supported systems. It's a situation that certainly an organization I'm involved with, Code Red TO, has been trying to draw attention to for a very long time. It isn't just or sustainable in the first place, and it absolutely is not now. We do need more provincial and possibly federal support and investment in transit, and we need to invest in it also to continue to make it safe, because the overcrowding that we have already right now on buses is not safe in a pandemic. Transit is a safe place to be. It's probably the safest public semi-enclosed place that you can be. It's safer than a gym or a restaurant or a grocery store. But being in close proximity with people, you know, basically face to face, even with masks, is generally not safe. So we need to invest to make sure that it is a reliable service, and we need to get people back on transit, because we cannot get everybody moving again in a city this size any other way.
Thanks so much. And Darnell Terene, did you want to just comment on sort of as we dig out of COVID, what to keep in mind or what you'd like to see?
Sure, yeah, I guess I would just like to see less description of what we need and more like addressing what we need, because I think a lot of these issues have been described sort of. There are a lot of people who never stopped working during the pandemic, and they were, you know, squished into buses, and now they're even more squished into buses. And you know, like these issues, for example, in Northwest Toronto, have been described for like, we've had the data for months. So why is nothing being done? Yeah, so that's my main. Yeah,
I mean, Adrian, we released our Greenway released a letter specifically regarding that in, I believe it was April. And it took a long time for us to get a lovely form response from Toronto Health. So, you know, that really is the summary of the situation, in that, you know, from our perspective, certainly we would like to work with the city to build out a conservancy and to actually have a place that works for people within the Northwest. And what we'd like to see, you know, there's a wonderful, speaking of things that are written and proposed, a wonderful repair and rebuild report that was put forward that really has some positive pathways for us to move forward. I'd like to see us act on that report rather than have it, you know, well, sit on a shelf, I suppose.
Yeah, so true. I love that sentiment. I do think this year taught us a lot about how we can take action and things can change very quickly and people can rally support. What seems like it could be impossible, but it's taught us a lot. And I think there's probably some things that we could probably leave in 2020, or things that we accidentally brought in from old habits in 2020, where infrastructure or service was cut, making assumptions on you know, who's using it or who would be using it and that sort of thing. But yeah, you know, I think this discussion really could go on for much longer. I do know we have to wrap up, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing your ideas with us. And for everyone who's watching, you know, all of our speakers here are either repping really incredible organizations, have amazing articles and research online that you can be accessing. And I do know that there is further resources being attached as well for websites and links and that sort of thing that you can easily access. So just as far as passing it back to EcoFair, they can make some closing remarks to wrap up our amazing discussion this evening.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. On behalf of EcoFair Toronto, I'd like to thank all the event organizers, presenters, and behind-the-scene volunteers that have made today's event such a great success. And I'd like to thank the audience for participating. As a part of Active and Healthy Week, we have a few more events happening. Starting tonight at midnight, we have a free screening of the film Bicycle, directed by Michael B. Clifford. Amazingly, we have Michael B. Clifford coming out for our talk on Saturday, so that's Saturday at 4 p.m. It's a talk inspired by the film, but we have so many amazing Toronto organizations coming out. Bike Share Toronto will be at that talk, as well as Cycle Toronto. Please check out the link, it'll be in the chat and on our website. We're also holding a Cooking with Plants lesson and conversation with the Veganabler and Mark Monachino from the Toronto Vegetarian Association. And once again, register on our website. And we'd love to have your feedback, so please fill out our survey. It's a really short survey and super easy to fill out. It will be in the chat, and I'll send it in the Eventbrite follow-up, but please, everyone, fill it out. Volunteers, the audience, presenters, we want your feedback. We want to do better. And once again, don't forget to check out the EcoFair Toronto website and the Eco Tours. We also have an exhibitor showcase coming up highlighting 40 sustainable businesses and organizations in Toronto, along with 1-minute videos we've been posting on our social media. And check out the family-friendly climate pledges and eco-fun and games online. We hope you've enjoyed this event and that you'll be back for more. Please visit our website once again, sorry. Events will continue throughout this week and next week. We're going all the way until Sunday, November 8th, and together we can make a difference. And I've learned so much from this session. Thanks again, and thanks for coming.